Your Navy? Let me guess. Desk duty. Shuffling papers? Never seen a real mission. Those words came from my father-in-law's arrogant friend, smirk plastered across his face in front of 12 dinner guests. My in-laws chuckled, waiting for me to shrink into my seat. But before I could speak, an older, quiet gentleman sitting at the head of the table set down his glass, looked straight into my eyes, and asked a single question. "What's your call sign, Commander?" The moment that name left my lips, the smirking guest turned ghost white, his fork froze mid-air, and the entire room went dead silent. Follow my story until the end to see how one question dismantled a room full of arrogance, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this reaches. My name is Avery Peterson. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 12 years, I have proudly served as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. Just 48 hours before sitting at this dinner table, I was on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, smelling jet fuel and watching the horizon after an intense 9-month overseas deployment. I was exhausted, sunburnt, and still readjusting to solid ground, but instead of sleeping in my own bed, I found myself sitting inside a private dining room at one of San Francisco's most exclusive country clubs. My father-in-law, Richard, had organized this dinner to celebrate his latest venture capital fund. To Richard and his wife, Evelyn, status was everything. They measured a person's entire worth by the make of their luxury watch, their country club tier, and the size of their stock portfolio. From the day their son Ethan introduced me to them, I was viewed as a disappointment. In their eyes, my military service wasn't an honorable sacrifice. It was an embarrassing, low-paying public service job that took away from their family's corporate pedigree. All evening, Richard monopolized the conversation, loudly boasting about his commercial real estate acquisitions and dropping 7-figure sums into every sentence. Whenever anyone politely asked about my return, Evelyn would quickly wave her manicured hand and redirect the conversation, as if my service was an awkward phase to be swept under the rug. I didn't mind the dismissal. In the Navy, you learn that real strength never needs to shout, and true competence speaks for itself without an audience. But the disrespect was only just beginning. The real disruption arrived 20 minutes later, when Douglas Harland walked in. Douglas was Richard's longtime tennis partner and a self-styled military authority. A former reserve staff officer who had spent 4 years in a climate-controlled procurement office in Virginia, Douglas wore his past like a medal of valor, rarely letting 10 minutes pass without reminding everyone of his service. Dressed in an overly tailored blazer with an anchor pin fastened to his lapel, he strutted over, greeted Richard with a hearty laugh, and pulled out the chair directly across from me. It didn't take long for him to turn his attention my way. "So, Avery," Douglas began, his voice dripping with condescension as he took a sip of 20-year-old scotch. "Richard mentioned your Navy. What do they have you doing? Shuffling paperwork in human resources? Managing supply closets?" A ripple of quiet chuckles broke out across the table. Evelyn smiled into her wineglass, while Richard nodded in amusement. "I'm an active-duty tactical aviator, Douglas," I replied calmly, setting my cloth napkin down. "Lieutenant Commander?" Douglas scoffed, leaning back and waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, please, let's be honest here. These days, they hand out promotions like candy to keep quotas up. You probably haven't seen a single day of real operational pressure, just routine ferry flights and simulator hours, right? Real missions are left to the professionals who actually know how to lead." Ethan attempted to cut in, but Douglas spoke over him, relishing the attention. He smirked around the table, waiting for me to blush or shrink in embarrassment. I simply looked at him, maintaining absolute composure while the room waited for the punchline. While the table indulged in Douglas's petty show, my attention drifted to the quiet man seated at the head of the long dining table. His name was Mr. Mercer. Richard had spent the entire week fawning over him, eager to secure his participation as a primary investor in the new fund. Throughout the evening, Mr. Mercer had barely uttered a dozen words. He wore an unpretentious gray suit, listened attentively, and observed the room with calm, penetrating gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When Douglas laughed at his own insult, Mr. Mercer placed his silver fork down with a sharp, definitive click. The subtle sound cut straight through the chatter. He ignored Richard's nervous chuckle and Douglas's smug grin, shifting his gaze directly down the table to fix entirely on me. His posture was immaculate, carrying the unmistakable, commanding stillness of a seasoned commander. When he spoke, his voice was deep, measured, and instantly demanded the undivided attention of every person in the room. "Lieutenant Commander Peterson," he stated, cutting across Douglas's ongoing smirk. "Which air wing were you deployed with?" A surprised hush fell over the guests. Douglas blinked, clearly irritated by the interruption, while Richard straightened up, eager to keep his prized investor engaged. "Carrier Air Wing 7, sir," I answered steadily, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "Strike Fighter Squadron 103. Mr. Mercer gave a subtle, knowing nod. "Flying the F/A 18F Super Hornet, if I recall correctly. Over 3,000 carrier traps across the fleet?" 3,200, sir." He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the mahogany table. "Then what is your call sign, Commander?" The dining room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the crystal chandelier overhead. Douglas scoffed under his breath, leaning back with a faint smirk, expecting a trivial, made-up nickname. "Valkyrie, sir," I answered clearly, keeping my eyes fixed on the man at the head of the table. The moment the word left my lips, Mr. Mercer closed his eyes for a single second, letting out a slow, deliberate breath. When he opened them, the casual demeanor of a polite dinner guest was entirely gone. He stood up slowly from his seat, buttoning his jacket with crisp military precision. "Valkyrie," he repeated, his deep voice carrying through every corner of the room. "The lead flight commander during Operation Cerberus Shield in the Eastern Mediterranean last November." Douglas's smirk wavered. Richard and Evelyn glanced at each other in utter confusion, completely lost. "For those at this table who don't know," Mr. Mercer continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, "I am retired Admiral Thomas Mercer. Up until 4 months ago, I served as commander of the United States Pacific Fleet." The color visibly drained from Douglas's face. He dropped his fork onto his plate, his mouth opening slightly in disbelief. "Lieutenant Commander Peterson here, call sign Valkyrie, is the aviator who led a 3-ship strike element through 0 visibility conditions to provide critical air support for a downed search and rescue team," Admiral Mercer said, his tone resolute with immense respect. "She took direct shrapnel damage, stayed on station until all 4 crew members were secured, and brought her aircraft back onto the carrier deck with a failed hydraulic line. For that action, she was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross." The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody breathed. Douglas looked like he had just seen a ghost. Admiral Mercer slowly turned his attention from me to Douglas Harland. The warmth and respect in the Admiral's eyes vanished, replaced by the freezing, uncompromising glare of a 4-star flag officer addressing a subordinate who had crossed an unforgivable line. "And you, Mr. Harland," Admiral Mercer said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, razor-sharp calm. "You seem to have quite a lot of opinions on real operational service for a man who spent his brief career behind an administrative desk in Norfolk." Douglas shrank back into his leather chair, trembling as cold sweat formed on his brow. "Sir, Admiral, I was only joking. I didn't mean any disrespect." "I remember your record across my desk, Harland," the Admiral interrupted coldly, not giving him an inch of room to breathe. transferred out of operational logistics after 2 failed readiness evaluations, followed by a formal letter of reprimand for insubordination. You barely managed 4 years of desk duty, yet you have the audacity to sit here in your tailored suit and mock an active combat aviator who put her life on the line while you played country club tennis. The table sat frozen in absolute mortification. Richard's glass shook against the saucer. Evelyn looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The very person they had treated as a low-level public servant was being openly honored by the most powerful, respected figure in the room. "You will stand up," Admiral Mercer commanded, his voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "You will look Lieutenant Commander Peterson in the eye, and you will apologize for your disgrace of a performance." Pale, shaking, and completely broken, Douglas pushed back his chair and stood. Douglas could barely keep his hands steady. His face was flushed with deep crimson shame as he looked across the table at me. I apologize, Commander Peterson," he stammered, his arrogant posture entirely collapsed. "I was wrong. Completely out of line." Without waiting for another word, Douglas grabbed his jacket and hurried out of the private dining room, the heavy oak doors closing behind him in absolute silence. Richard scrambled to his feet, desperate to salvage the evening and his multi-million-dollar investment proposal. "Admiral Mercer, please, let me apologize for my associate's behavior," Richard pleaded, wiping his brow with a trembling cloth napkin. He clearly spoke out of turn. "If we could just refocus on the fund's portfolio, I assure you." Admiral Mercer raised a single hand, stopping Richard mid-sentence. "Richard, you invited me here tonight to evaluate the character and leadership of your venture," the Admiral said in a calm, unyielding voice. "A man who allows an honorable veteran, let alone his own daughter-in-law, to be openly insulted at his table to stroke the ego of a loudmouth coward has no understanding of true leadership." He took his overcoat from the back of his chair. "I will not be investing in your fund. In fact, I will make sure my associates are aware of how business is conducted under your roof." Evelyn sat utterly paralyzed, staring at the table in horror. Richard looked as though his entire world had crumbled in a matter of seconds, finally realizing that the daughter-in-law they had dismissed for years possessed more honor and respect than their millions could ever buy. Admiral Mercer walked around the table, stopped beside my chair, and offered a crisp, heartfelt salute, which I returned with pride. "Thank you for your service, Valkyrie," he said softly, before turning to exit into the cool night air. That evening taught me an invaluable lesson that has guided my career ever since. Loud arrogance is almost always a mask for profound insecurity. True competence, real courage, and genuine integrity never need to raise their voice or demand validation from people who measure worth by bank accounts and titles. When you stand firm in who you are, the truth has a way of revealing itself at the exact right moment. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to deal with an arrogant family member or colleague who tried to diminish your hard work? Share your experience in the comments below.